بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, we wanted to close this auspicious month with just a reminder of some basic principles that Allah and His Messenger have called us to, of how we turn to Allah Most High. And we are looking at select aphorisms, Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah regarding this. And Ibn Ata'illah's Hikam is one of the great summaries of the spiritual tradition of Islam, the way of ihsan, whose purpose and fruit is the realization of one's slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such that one worships Allah as though one beholds Him, such that one lives and turns to Allah in every aspect of one's life in a state of consciousness, awareness, and beholding of Allah, so that one is more conscious of Allah than of what is around one, because He is more real than anything else. And this is really as we emphasized yesterday, the real purpose of life. What is the purpose of life? It is to know Allah, right? And what is your business in life? Your business in life is to be busy with Allah, right? So, and someone who's busy with other than this has missed the boat. He's missed the boat. They don't realize what is really real. But things are needed to make this happen, because it's easy to say, yes, I accept. Right? But it's not like turning on the light. They say, okay, it's better to keep the lights on at night, so you turn them on. And that's it. Right? This is not just something that one accepts as true, it is a realization. And that realization is a precious realization, and there's a price for it. Okay? As one of the poets said, أَيُّهَا الْعَاشِقُ مَعْنَ حُسْنِنَا مَهْرُنَا غَالٍ لِمَنْ يَخْطِبُنَا. O one longing to realize the meaning of our beauty, our dowry is high for one who would court us. And our dowry, the payment the one who seeks to marry someone makes, is high for one who would court us. And what is it? جَسَدٌ مُدْنَى وَرُوحٌ فِي الْعَنَى. A body that is exhausted, and a soul ever toiling. وَعُيُونٌ لَمْ تَذُوقِ الْوَسَنَ. And eyes that have not tasted even drowsiness. وَفُؤَادٌ لَيْسَ فِيهِ غَيْرُنَا. And a heart in which there isn't other than us. فَإِذَا مَا شِئْتَ أَدِّ الثَّمَنَ. So if you wish, if you seek, then pay the price. It says, وَعَنِ الْكَوْنَيْنِ كُنْ مُنْخَلِعًا. And from both worlds, divest yourself. And that is the spiritual divestment movement. We have a worldly divestment movement that we should be supporting, but also spiritual divestment, which you divest yourself of primacy of concern for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But how do you attain that? How do you attain that? One of the things that you should pay attention to when you recite the Quran is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not only tell us about Himself in the Quran or about this world. He doesn't just tell us about what to do. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us about ourselves. There are numerous verses that describe essential qualities or typical qualities of the human being. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. The human has been created weak. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ عَجُولًا. The human being has been created hasty. The human being has been created with a love of the immediate. وَتُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةَ. You love the immediate. وَتَذَرُونَ الْآخِرَةَ. And you leave aside the hereafter, or what comes after. And many other qualities are mentioned about the human being. But there is besides the spiritual neediness of the human being, there's a practical weakness to the human being, which is why, what do humans do? Right? Humans are social animals because they perceive their weaknesses. I can't possibly do everything that I need. And people have different temperaments, etc. Some people are really hands-on. If there's work to do, they want to be the first person to do it. There's others who are very hands-off. There's work to do, they flee in the opposite direction. And so people come together. People come together for the fulfillment of those needs. But the same is true spiritually. That given our weakness, our waywardness, our tendency to heedlessness, our finding comfort in the immediate, and immediate gratification seems more real than something that appears to be far off. So company is very important. Company is very important at many levels. The company you keep, firstly, helps define what you prioritize in life. Because the company you keep, you deal with them, and their concerns rub off on you. What they talk about, what they busy themselves with, rubs off on you. Even if you even if you didn't care about soccer, if you were hanging out with people who did, you'd know a lot about the World Cup just by the fact that they're following it. Right? And even the social media company you keep, right? I didn't have to go looking anywhere to find out that Real Madrid apparently hired some Chilean player. Why? Because a bunch of people on my Twitter feed were all like jumping up and down about that. Whatever his name is. So the company you keep affects what you think about, what you incline towards. It affects what you do, because it is in the company of others that a lot of the time that we spend and what we end up doing happens. So that company affects both the goals you have in life, the attitude that you have in life, what you busy yourself in life with, your general direction in life, which is why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-mar'u ala dini khalilih." A person will be on the religious way of their closest friends, the khalil, your intimate friends. فَلْيَنْظُرْ أَحَدُكُمْ مَنْ يُخَالِلْ. So let each of you look carefully as to whose close company they keep. But then, if you are seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose company should you keep? Whose company should you keep? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ. O you believe, be mindful of Allah and be with those who are true, the people of sidq, those who are true in their commitment to Allah, right? Who are true in their covenant with Allah. Why? Because if you're someone who's striving for mindfulness, right, you want to make that your distinguishing quality, right? Because that's what faith entails. Oh, you believe? Be mindful of Allah. Ittaqullah. How do you acquire taqwa? By being with those who are true to Allah. Because it is those that will be upholding taqwa, that will be upholding the other virtues entailed by iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us also in the Quran, اتَّبِعْ سَبِيلَ مَنْ أَنَابَ إِلَيْهِ. Follow the path of those who have turned to me. Okay? Because why? Because if you are seeking to turn to Allah, then be with those who have turned to Him. The Prophet ﷺ explained that عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْجَمَاعَةِ, be with the group, وَإِيَّاكُمْ وَالْفُرْقَةِ, and beware of going alone. فَإِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ قَرِيبٌ مِنَ الْوَاحِدِ, for the shaitan is close to the one alone. وَهُوَ مِنِ الْإِثْنَيْنِ أَبْعَدْ, and is more distant from two. مَنْ أَرَادَ بُحْبُوحَةَ الْجَنَّةِ فَلْيَلْزَمِ الْجَمَاعَةِ. Whoever seeks the vast expanses of paradise, let them hold fast to the group. Because it is there that you will find support. That you're weak on your own, even with one other person, you will find assistance and confirmation. This is a reality that in many ways goes against a lot of our modern attitudes. They say in New York City, there's, in some parts of New York City certainly, particularly right in the heart of New York City, there's 50% of people living on their own. And there's a whole phenomenon of there's a book of living alone, right? Going solo. A whole bunch of books written on this phenomenon of people living on their own. And this is very detrimental at every level, right? It's detrimental emotionally. It's detrimental socially. But most fundamentally, it is detrimental religiously, because you are weak. And the human being has tendencies of good and tendencies towards the bad, towards what is sinful and wayward and disadvantageous. On one's own, it is hard to struggle. The struggle on one's own against the wayward tendencies seems very difficult. And the struggle to do the good seems more onerous. Which is why the Prophet ﷺ told us that if people knew how detrimental it is to go to sleep alone in a house, and literally if you bait in a room, no person would go to sleep even one night on their own. And the Malikis actually list this as being makruh. Shaykh Rami Hafidahullah I was asking, I was mentioning that, this phenomenon. We're just discussing some issues that struggles people deal with, etc., how they get waswasa, misgivings. I said, in the Maliki school, because of this hadith, they mentioned explicitly that it's makruh to go to sleep alone. And there's great wisdom in it. There's great wisdom in it. And the fuqaha would say, well, not necessarily, a room may be a bit awkward because a bit, privacy, this and that, but at the very least, living alone, right? It's detrimental. The Prophet ﷺ discouraged eating alone, that the best of food is what most hands eat from. The food of one is enough for two. And that's not just some kind of nutritional calculation, which is actually true. Simple calculation, whatever you want to eat half of it and you're safe. That the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that the higher level is to eat enough to maintain one's strength and one's health, so that one can do the good, worldly and religious, that one needs. But if you need to eat more, the Prophet ﷺ said, so a third. That's the dispensation. That's not like the ideal, but the sunnah dispensation. So a third, that فإن كان لا محالة, if you have no alternative, then a third for your food, a third for your drink, and a third to be able to breathe. Right? And one of the things that those who eat a lot say at the end of eating, I can't even breathe. Right? Or there's Indo-Pak expressions that I'm exploding because there's no, and that's not. But what's a third? A third of your fill, the ulama say, and this is not meant to be mathematical. You're not supposed to measure, but just as that a third of your fill is about half of what you would normally eat. Because normally you don't stuff yourself. Normally you eat till people eat till they're full. But a third of your fill is about half of what you would normally incline towards eating. But even in eating, the Prophet ﷺ said the best of food is what most hands eat from. Then you should seek out others to eat with. Even if you have food for yourself, share it with someone else. Don't eat alone. That's one of the things to do during lunchtime. People say, well, how do we do da'wah? I mean, it's a bit absurd that you're running around looking for people to do da'wah to, and the people in your immediate circles, you don't do da'wah to. But how does a da'wah begin? Calling someone to Allah first means that you have a line of communication with them. You have a line of communication. How do those lines of communication begin? They begin socially. How? Eating together. Right? These kinds of things. These are opportunities of all kinds of good. So, with eating, with traveling, the Prophet, we always talk about the fiqh related to women traveling on their own, this and that. What is the ruling of a man traveling on his own? There's hadiths that if people knew the great dangers of travel, the great harms of travel, no one would travel on their own if they fear, if they believed in Allah and feared Him. There's a number of hadiths related to that. And again, this is when you're able to. You can't always do that, but you're just going. Some people do wacky things. I have a friend said, "I'm really depressed these days." So why? Because I like eating sushi, so I go for sushi, but I feel really depressed. I said, "Who do you go with?" I go on my own. No wonder. I mean, most people should if you actually think how miserable, and how miserable. But even with travel, and there's many wisdoms in that, and it's a sunnah that if you're going to travel somewhere, to seek out good company. And that's when you have discretion, and very often you do. You're going to an Islamic conference, just go there on your own. So a big missed opportunity. This is an opportunity to establish a relationship with someone. It just requires a little bit of effort to coordinate that. And you find many, many benefits. So all of these things, there's numerous other aspects of the sunnah with respect to emphasizing keeping good company. Look at whose company the Prophet ﷺ kept. The people he was closest to were the best of believers. One, because they kept his close company, but secondly, because they had the greatest latent potential virtue as well. Who were the people closest to him? They're the best of creation after the prophets. There's one aspect, how did they become the best of people? But also, what company did the Prophet ﷺ choose? What company did Abu Bakr after him, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, keep? Who was he closest to? He was closest to Sayyidina Umar. Even though if you look at read their biographies, and if you haven't read their biographies, you should feel ashamed. Their temperaments were like completely different. What brought them together? See, the Sahaba, the company they kept. Right? The Prophet ﷺ himself found it quite difficult temperamentally to be with Ahl Suffah, with the people of the bench who were at the back of the masjid, for a number of reasons. One, because the Meccans were like the aristocrats of the Arabs. They had the most refined language, they had the most refined culture, they considered themselves to have the most refined akhlaq and adab. And a lot of the Ahl Suffah, and some of them were Meccan, one, they were just in abject poverty, and they're in a very difficult state, which is one of the reasons the obligation for the ghusl of Jum'ah, for the purificatory bath on Friday, came. Because the Prophet ﷺ himself was finding it very difficult. Right? That it just smelled really bad because they're in dire poverty. And some of it by choice. Many of these were traders who had been very wealthy, but they chose to dedicate themselves completely to learning, to worship, to devotion. Like Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, for example, and others, who was a wealthy trader from those. But the Prophet ﷺ is commanded himself to remain with those who call upon Allah by night and day, seeking His countenance alone in life. Right? Even though temperamentally it was not initially easy for him, but this is what was beloved to the Lord. So that and he actually prayed for it. That Allah, make me live make me live in poverty and resurrect me in that state. Right? With the poor. Right? I mean, those who are who realize their poverty to Allah, not just material poverty. So this is a major point of emphasis, right? The company that one keeps is very critical. So Ibn Ata'illah tells us, لا تصحب من لا ينهضك حاله ولا يدلك على الله مقاله. And the Arabic is a language of rhetoric, of eloquence. That this is so powerfully said, you can just keep repeating it just because how beautiful it is, regardless of what it means. Right? And that's one thing you have to understand about the Arabs. The Arabs used to win wars on the basis of rhetoric. You could just go and embarrass the enemy by saying some lines of poetry, and they'd just walk away and say, we lost. Why do you lose? Because they embarrassed us. Right? Sometimes you wonder, like, why are they making these very bombastic statements? Because that's how it used to be. Right? So, لا تصحب من لا ينهضك حاله. Don't keep the company of one whose state doesn't uplift you. ولا يدلك على الله مقاله. And whose words don't point you to Allah. So someone could say, well, my wife's company doesn't uplift me. So should I not keep her company? My parents, their words, my dad just talks about cricket. So his words don't point me to Allah. So there goes dad as well. Right? What's meant here, لا تصحب. Right? لا تصحب. And this is one of the dangers, right? One of the dangers, that texts have words, the meanings of words are framed by their context, by their purpose, right? By their context, by their purpose. And if you don't understand the context or the purpose, you can misunderstand and abuse that. It's like medication. Is this good medicine? You go to a doctor and say, is this good medicine? So, well, depends on your circumstance and what your need is and how you take it. And that's true also, true particularly religious, in our deen. That in religion, different religious guidance has different purposes. And if taken wrong, can be detrimental. If you take something like this literally, don't keep the company of one whose state doesn't uplift you, you could come to a conclusion from that is contrary to what is meant. Right? So don't keep the company of one whose state doesn't uplift you. Imam Zarruq explains that what's meant here by company, he says, الصحبة هنا الملازمة المقتضية للمداخلة والموافقة. Right? Here, what's meant by company is not just association and relation. It's not association and relation. Because your business partner, they may be, the greatest worldly blessing you have, they may be openly corrupt, but they're really good. They're a really good business partner. So you associate with them on that basis. You may be getting some mentorship in your career from someone who's an Islamophobic, right-wing, evangelical Christian, but the association there is on the basis of something very different. What's meant by company here? The company here is the companionship that one keeps in order to direct oneself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? To direct oneself to Allah. Right? That the companionship that one keeps, I want to be like these people. Right? It is the company, that the discretionary company one chooses to direct oneself as one seeks to be directed in life. Right? In seeking assistance in righteousness and piety. تعاونوا على البر والتقوى, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran. Assist one another in righteousness and mindfulness. Right? That is the company that's meant here. Is whom you take as a companion in life. Okay? That keeps you from the Quranic call, وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ, and do not assist one another in sin and enmity. Okay, so that's what's meant by company here. And that, given that that's the company, and whose words don't direct you towards Allah, right? Whose company doesn't uplift you, how? Right? What's meant by uplifting here? That you're affected in the company that you keep. You're affected in the company that you keep, not just by what you do together, but you're affected by the state and attitude of your companion. By the state and attitude of your companion. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ used this beautiful example. He said the example of the righteous companion is like the example of the perfume seller, the attar. If you don't get some of their perfume yourself, you'll get some of the good smell. So you go to the perfume shop. If they don't give you some, at least you leave smelling good, right? Just because it smelled good. Okay? Whereas the example of the bad company is like the example of an ironsmith. That if you stay close with them long enough, if you don't get some sparks burning you, at least you leave with a bad smell. Right? At least you leave with a bad smell. So, do not keep the company of one whose state doesn't uplift you. Say, well, they're not doing anything haram, they're not doing, but the company is not just about what you do, but it's also the state of that company. The state of that company. And whose words point you to Allah, they say, this is because the good company is at two levels. Sorry, I just, while we're having this class, I was busy downloading the OS X Yosemite beta. I'm going to take a risk, relying on the blessing of this month of Ramadan, to install the beta version of the operating system on my primary laptop, hoping that nothing goes wrong. But I told the computer just to wait a sec. And whose words don't point you to Allah, this is referring particularly because there's two levels of company that you keep, of discretionary company. One is the general companions that one has, but also there's a subset of that company that one keeps, that one seeks out the company of exemplars, of people one wants to benefit from their guidance, their teachings. Right? So one has two levels of company. There's good companions who have similar goals and aspirations and who inspire one and facilitate for one through their own example in that direction, but also part of that, the company that uplifts one is company that directs one towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through, whether it be through spiritual guidance or religious guidance, through their own higher example, etc. So that is, those are two types of company that is in itself beneficial. But then the question arises that there's other company that one needs to keep. And you can't exactly say, well, my business partner, he doesn't fit this definition, I'm going to leave them. Someone says, you know what, my husband, he doesn't uplift me. So, that's going to wreak havoc in all kinds of ways. And one is that if you look at this in one way, this is talking about the discretionary companionship. Whom do you take for what is the Prophet ﷺ referred to as musahaba? You're the people you take as your life companions, those whom you spend time with, hang out with, you visit them regularly, they visit you, etc. The discretionary company. But then, what about the other company? The ulama mentioned that good company is of two types. Okay? One is company that is in itself good. Company that's in itself good. Okay? That these are the companions who have similar aspirations to one. They're striving towards what you're seeking. And people, even people of merely worldly concern. You want to be successful, you want to get ahead as a doctor, who will you hang out with? Hang out with doctors, because that's part of your, there's networking, etc. And you see other people who are, trying to get ahead in their career, etc. And it spurs you along, and those relationships help you go forward. But if you have spiritual aspirations, you would seek good companions and exemplars. Right? That's just one type of good company. The other type of, so there's company that's in itself good, given one's spiritual goals, but the other company, and this is very important, is company that is made good, right? Which is company that's kept with good purpose and intent in a good way. So you're concerned about Canada's, foreign policy when it comes to environmental matters. And frankly, Canada is one of the worst offenders, sadly, even worse than our neighbors down south when it comes to the environmental record of our companies overseas. Our companies, Canada has very large mining companies, etc., have caused unbelievable amounts of destruction in Brazil and Argentina and West Africa and elsewhere. But of course, Canadians have Canada successfully has the British touch of being very graceful in crime. Okay? And there's much to be proud of in this country, but there's things that you're worried about that. So you find people who have concern about that. And they may be anarchists and radical, etc., but there's a particular matter that you want to be part of the good in that. But you say, well, their state doesn't uplift me spiritually with Allah. Their words don't point me to Allah. Should I keep away from them? No. That company can be good. How? If kept with good purpose and intent in a good way. In a good way. At work, right? Most of your colleagues, they don't have spiritual aspirations, etc. How do you relate well with them? Right? And the believer is not someone who should go into a shell. Rather, that also is company that can be good if it's kept with good purpose and intent. In good ways. And what are those good ways? The ways mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. أَطْعِمُوا الطَّعَامُ وَأَفْشُوا السَّلَامَ. Feed others. Spread the greeting of peace. Feed others, greet others, right? Visit someone who's sick, someone who's in need. Be the first, strive to be the first to assist them. Right? Share in their happiness, comfort them in their sadness, all these different things. Right? Assist them. Right? So someone's stuck in they're trying to figure out how to reconcile different documents, and you know how to do it, but you're like, let them figure it out. Right? You go in, and that's a good motive to help someone out. Why? That's beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And kept these and broader. How do you keep good company with your neighbor, with others who may have no spiritual concern, may not care about religion, whatever. This is how you keep it. Someone asked Shaykh Ali Jum'a, the former Mufti of Egypt, and Egyptians are wired differently from other people, right? And so someone asked him, and this is after a very serious religious class, and this is a very, one of the senior most scholars alive, and someone asked him, هل يجوز للنصراني دخول الحمام لقضاء الحاجة? Said, is it permitted for us to let a Christian enter the mosque to relieve themselves? And so he said, he pretended first to answer seriously. He said, Naam, is. Said, yes, it is permissible. But then he looked and he said, Lakin ya ikhwani. He said, oh my dear brothers, let's not embarrass ourselves. نظفوا الحمامات. Keep the toilets clean. But then he switched. He said, how do people imagine that a place like Egypt became Muslim? Right? A small little army came and took over. They were welcomed, but there's still how did people enter Islam? Through social relations. Right? It says, Dawood was sitting there smoking the argila, right? The shisha. It says back in the days when the shisha was still halal, and okay, of course there's no shisha back then. He's sitting and he says to his neighbor, "Why don't you come and sit with me? Like let's eat together." And they start discussing, and he gets interested. And this is, but also this is part of your humanity. It's just part of your humanity. So that is also from good company, right? If kept in a good way, with a good intention in it, right? And that's an aspect that a lot of us are very remiss in. But that on its own is not sufficient, because in order to nurture to guard and strengthen one's spiritual inclination, one needs to seek out good company, actively, right? And to keep that company. Imam al-Ghazali mentioned there's 5 qualities of good company. Right? He said the first two, right, the first two and arguably the last one as well, right, the first two and the last one apply to any good company, even worldly good company. One is intelligence and good character. He said it's better to have an intelligent enemy than a foolish friend, right? Because the intelligent enemy won't do anything crazy, okay? So you can predict what they'll do, because they'll act on the basis of intelligence. In Syria, they'd say if you have the mukhabarat, the intelligence after you, make dua that you have an intelligent agent, an intelligence agent on your case. If they're intelligent, you can predict what they're likely to do, and they won't do anything crazy. Harm is to be feared from fools. Right? So you seek intelligence. Okay? Good character. Because even in worldly terms, you don't want to hang out with someone who's going to give you a hard time by the way they are. The fifth is truthfulness. Truthfulness. Because otherwise, how can you trust them? The other two, the distinguishing quality, and these are very important because you want to acquire virtue. You want to acquire virtue. And good character, truthfulness are two of the central virtues. But with that, in the good company that you seek out righteousness, salah, renunciation, non-attachment to the merely worldly. Some people can't stop talking just about material things. Right? Even in worldly terms, all they can talk about is the material. Right? So these are qualities that one should be looking at in the company that one seeks out. Right? So this is the hikmah that we wanted to touch upon. Right? Don't keep the company, la tashab. Right? Don't choose the company. Right? Or the companionship, really, of one whose state does not uplift you and whose words do not point you to Allah. These are also the qualities of the kind of religious people that you should be around. Because sometimes we assess, there's false standards of religiosity. Right? That it's not about someone said, he gives a powerful lesson, etc. Even before you assess their words, first look at their state. How is their conduct and character? Secondly, that even in religious teachings, those religious teachings, what are they instilling? Because sometimes we get attracted, even people who are not necessarily quote unquote that religious, get attracted to religious melodrama. Right? That okay, I got tired of Bollywood movies, let me see some religious drama. I'm least interested, but I got several people sharing some Pakistani religious TV show host, doing some really wacky things all Ramadan. They said, I looked at what is it? I saw like 5 seconds. I said, this is disgraceful. I switched off. But people like that. Okay? That we watch religious programs. No, but what is the criteria for any religiosity that is of benefit, that is points you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? These are the two criteria. That its state uplifts you. It helps you with qualities that are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Instills humility in you, good character, care and concern for others, mercy, gentleness, right? And it points you towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because that's the heart of the deen. It's acquisition of virtue and turning towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's how we judge the kind of religious guidance that one seeks. What lesson should you go to? Oh, it's packed with information. Right? But that's not, it's not the one who has the most religious information wins. It's so amazing how he refutes all these sects. What are you, like trying to sort of, like people keep a census, you're trying to determine who goes where? Right? That's entertainment. And if it's actually better not to watch such things than spend time watching them. Oh, that show is so fascinating. We got so much insight into Shia and Sunni splits. So are you thinking of, even if you're thinking of what group you want to belong to or whatever, go read about it. Don't get stuck in a controversy, because in a controversy no one's going to be honest and truthful. Everyone's lying to each other, like in debates and stuff. So even if you want to do that, be intellectually honest with yourself and read and study. Don't watch these arguments and debates. Right? So part of and that's company that one keeps, because we keep a lot of virtual company of the things that we read and follow online. With religious things that are not of clear benefit, that won't uplift you, that won't point you towards Allah, keep away from them. Because these are detrimental. They're bid'ah. Because what's the way of the Prophet ﷺ? قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ. Say, this is my path, I call to Allah. أَنَا عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, with insight. أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي, I and those who follow me. So the concern of those whose company one wants to keep, wants to choose, are people whose concern is turning towards Allah. They're striving for virtue. It is not the self-righteous. Right? It's not the self-righteous. As Ibn Ata'illah mentions elsewhere, that it is for you to keep the company of an ignorant person who does not have self-righteousness, who is not content with themselves, is better for you than to keep the company of a scholar who has self-righteousness, who thinks highly of themselves. Said, because what ignorance does an ignorant person have if they're not content with themselves? And what knowledge does a person of knowledge have if they have self-righteousness? Right? And that's phenomenon to be careful about, because there's the idea of bad religiosity in every religious tradition. They talk about there's some people get religious, but you get a sense, and it's politically incorrect to say but that as they became more religious, you feel they became a worse person. That they're perfectly safe human being before, but as they get more religious, they're like intolerable. Right? But what's the danger? The danger in religiosity is self-righteousness. Right? I am better than him, and that's the falling of the shaitan. Where someone who just an average person, right? They don't think I'm all that, etc. You ask them, they say, I'm full of shortcomings, I'm failing in my relationship. Well, that's humility. Humility is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So, don't be deceived by just mere appearance. Oh, he's got a big beard, must be like, she wears a huge jilbab, must be like, those aren't mere criteria for religiosity. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who seek the best of company, who strive for the best of states, and who strive to direct ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and who strive to make all the company that we keep in life, in our relating to family, with friends, in our associations at work, and with neighbors in our community, we make that part of our good company by framing those relationships in good, beneficial ways, maintaining high intentions therein, seeking the pleasure of Allah in all these relationships, and that we don't merely just hang out with people, but we strive to make those relationships based on good. Right? And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us keep this momentum and concern of turning towards Allah beyond this month and in our lives. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira. Before we close, any questions? Go ahead.
So, in the second category, you mentioned about the good company that one could keep, so a company that good could come out of and not necessarily good in itself. Generally, I think some people would agree that one could see a lot of dangers around that, right? Because it could pull one going in thinking that, all right, good's going to come out of this. So how can one safeguard themselves?
So how does one safeguard oneself in those relationships? You have to take care of the state of your heart. Right? Number one, right? You have to take care, because if you don't take care of the state of your heart, you're at risk wherever you are. Right? So that's one part of it. Right? One part of it. The other part of it is to go into these things where one can with others. So you have other friends. You say, look, there's this really good project. Why don't we both get involved in it? Right? And also you frame it in a good way. So you have a number of friends from high school back in Spain. I'm still actively in contact with them. A number of them I've met as I've traveled in different places. Now we have many points of where our concerns are very different, but you frame it in a good way. So I have a childhood friend of mine, Alex. He's an environmentalist. He's a marine biologist, and married to a marine biologist. So we met at UC Davis, where he's a researcher, and the safest thing to do is food. because there's nothing particularly harmful about food. So we met up. I was there at an MSA conference. So he came to the program, and he's actually very interested. He was talking about activism and stuff. He's like, "This is fascinating." But afterwards, we went to a Kashmiri restaurant. It wasn't a very authentic Kashmiri restaurant because I didn't, because it had like seafood and all kinds of things. And Kashmir is not very close to the sea, so it's a bit questionable. Like, how was all this from Kashmir? But it was good, and and there's, so that's part of, you have a broad network of social relations, and you frame it in good ways. There's, most things in life are permissible and wholesome, right? And one keeps, one frames the relationships in those ways. There's other times where, there's some things that you don't engage in. There's other things that you do. I had a tour of the UK with folks with the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, and had some programs in London. And this friend of mine, my mother might remember, Nino, he contacted me. He said, "Guess what? I'm in London at the same time," and he does fundraising dance parties for some environmental cause. So he said, because he checked, because he saw the Facebook event, it finished just before his dance party was starting. So he said, like, "I can get you some special passes, whatever." I said, "Man, I have a long tour, etc. Why don't we meet up tomorrow for coffee?" He said, "I'd love to do that," but he was flying off to Ibiza for another fundraising dance concert, right? But there's many points of confluence. So something that it's not in accordance with your values, you don't engage in that. But there's much else that you can engage in, right? You meet up for coffee, you maintain relations, etc. You find other points of agreement, right? You find other points of agreement, and from these things, a lot of good comes out. So, for example, last year I went to Wales, and there in Newport, there's a Muslim couple. They're very active in the broader community as well, and they keep in contact with their neighbors. And they found that the local church was really struggling because no one was coming to the church, and they were in danger of losing their funding from their diocese or whatever, because they only had a dozen people coming on Sunday for worship. The whole neighborhood is now Muslim. So what do? And they didn't know how to deal with it, because most of these were recent immigrants, etc., and they're kind of wary. So because they had good relations with these people, just on this social basis and broader, so they met and stuff and said, "Is there any way we can serve them?" And the church, of course, they have a concern for service, etc., but they're also worried we're going to lose our funding. These are our jobs, right? So there's the balance of consideration. So because they had these good relationships and they knew each other, they started opening up the church, and the Muslims in that area didn't have any place, any social space, and they didn't know how to access social services. And very often government agencies can be a bit cold and very bureaucratic. So the church, 6 days a week, 90% of the people using it are Muslims. There's a daycare. Every child in the daycare is Muslim. There's all these services, and they're very careful that, look, we don't proselytize to the Muslims. And they said there's no point. They're more intense than our own people. Right? And there's actually Muslims who are facilitating funding to keep the church open. Why? Because it's serving the Muslims. But these things establish good relations. Right? They establish good, when done, in a right way. And that's one example. There are many other things, and one has to have broader good relations. And even at the level of with our own children, for example, very often, the world is not black and white. Right? It's not black and white. What is good company for your children? We found, for example, we homeschool our children, but the kids joined this art. Started archery with this Muslim group, and the kids were actually pretty shockingly badly behaved. And afterwards, they switched. The next session, they switched to the Mississauga homeschoolers, which is only like 10-15% Muslim. But these are concerned Christian families, and they're concerned about virtue and character and this and that. And they're actually, were they not better behaved? Yeah, right? So the world's not black and white. So you frame it in a good way. Like, what's harmful about, so you don't just let them roam like the buffalo wherever they may go, right? But you frame that in a good way, with a good purpose, right? And one shouldn't, feel shy. But at the same time, if you only have this kind of company, then your faith will remain stunted. Your spiritual growth will be limited. You need to have the company of those who have similar aspirations. And where do you find them? You find them in the places where you find such people, right? Where people have concern for learning, where they have concern for spirituality, where they have concern for service, right? That's where, so if those are places where you spend your discretionary time, then, or some of your discretionary time, then those are places where you're likely to find good company. If people come to the stage and I say, I need to get married, I want to find someone religious. But they don't keep any religious company. I was busy with my career. Good. But, where do you expect this person you want to marry to come from? They'll fall in front of you, you'll trip over them and say, oh, seems like a good Muslim, right? If you don't keep good company, you don't associate in circles where the kinds of people who have the kinds of aspirations that you have, where are you going to run into them? We believe in miracles. We don't rely on miracles. Some sister sitting there said, I don't know how I'll get married. So what's your plan? No one's proposing to me. How will they find that you exist? How will other people who are connected know that you exist? Yeah? Your parents won't let you marry anyone except from your village in rural Punjab, and there's no eligible bachelors there. And you're not going to, so this is very important. That good company is the key to so much good in our lives. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah.